So good morning, everyone. We will get started in a few minutes. So just give us a few more minutes to have additional attendees participate. So hold just 1 second for us while we work through this morning. And again, we are recording, so this meeting will be available later in a recorded, recorded message. We will have it on our webpage, and Alyssa will share that information as we make it available. And then we will also have the slides, but I'll get into that as we share a little bit more about this morning's topic. So just bear with us for a few more minutes as we allow guests to enter. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I hope everyone can hear me. If not, please, feel free to let us know either by raising your hand or in the chat, just letting us know if there's any type of audio deficiencies. So good morning again, and welcome to today's online seminar, which is being hosted by the South Bend Human Rights Commission. My name is Diana Moya, and I am the housing manager for the commission. I'd like to also at this time take an opportunity to welcome my co-facilitator this morning, Commissioner Ed Henry. Commissioner Henry is the chair of the Commission's Housing Committee and has been an active member of the Commission for many, many years. And so he will be, actually he's already on, so I can see his name here. So we can count on his presence to co-facilitate today's seminar. So today's webinar is in conjunction with the Commission's outreach efforts in April, which is recognized as National Fair Housing Month. And so we spoke with Judith Fox, who is our guest speaker today, and the topic, of course, that we will be covering is gender issues in housing. But we will also be covering the topic of land contracts, which has always presented its own issues and impediments in fair housing as well. And so I believe that next week we're in for also a great seminar, also covered by Judy. And so we look forward to seeing you then as well. It will be held at 10 a.m. And of course, if you have not received that link and you would like to be a participant during that seminar, please let us know, and we will definitely put you on the email blast that we send out. So Without further ado, today's topic again will cover gender issues in housing, and our guest speaker is Judith Fox. And so let me introduce Judith. Judith Fox is a clinical professor of law at the Notre Dame Law School, where she teaches and practices consumer law. She joined the faculty in 1997 and teaches courses in consumer law and negotiation. Ms. Fox directs the Economic Justice Project, a low-income clinic specializing in foreclosure and debt collection defense. Ms. Fox's advocacy and research focuses on housing issues and debt collection. She has served on a number of boards and committees, including the Consumer Advisory Board of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the National Association of Consumer Advocates, the United Way, and the Indiana Mortgage Foreclosure Task Force. She was recently appointed by the Indiana Supreme Court to the Coalition for Access to Justice, where she serves as the chair of the Data Committee. Ms. Fox has received numerous awards for her advocacy, including the Rodney F. Gainey PhD Faculty Community-Based Research Award for her research on foreclosure issues in Indiana, and the Grenville Clark Award for voluntary activities that advance the cause of peace and human rights. Ms. Fox provides trainings and seminars across the country on issues related to the mortgage foreclosure and debt collection. Ms. Fox has authored a number of publications on issues of foreclosure and debt collection. Her recent book, Foreclosure Echo: How the Hardest Hit Have Been Left Out of the Economic Recovery, focuses on the housing issues which remain in the wake of the recent foreclosure crisis. And so, good morning to everyone again. Welcome. If you haven't already, please put yourself on mute. And Judy, I'd like to turn this over to you.
Thanks so much. Gonna give me a second here to put this on. Okay. So thank you again. Hope everybody can see the slides. Thank you for having me. This is a really timely and important topic, not just because it's Fair Housing Month, but also because there's some developments in this area that are worth mentioning and important to talk about. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the Fair Housing Act, obviously, some new regulations that HUD brought out. I also want to talk about maybe some more tangential issues, some things that are important, I think, in our state to understand about domestic violence, and then also the housing wealth gap, which is an important gender issue that really needs a little more exploration by all of us. So what's fair housing? Well, fair housing covers both the sales, rental, financing of housing. Right now, eviction probably is one of the hottest, unfortunate topics in housing, and something we're seeing a lot of, and people are having a lot of time finding rental housing. Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, and familiar status. The familiar status and handicap was added after the act was enacted, but today we're going to talk about discrimination based on sex. Indiana also has a Fair Housing Act, and it pretty much mirrors the federal act. So, if it's a violation of the federal act, it is almost definitely going to be a violation of the Indiana Act as well. The other thing that the Indiana Act does that I wanted to bring out is that it makes it actually a criminal offense to intimidate or interfere with or attempt to imitate or interfere with someone who's trying to get housing. So whether that's buying or selling or renting, you can't essentially try to prevent someone based on a protected status. And again, today we're talking mostly about sex, from getting housing or applying for housing or enjoying the benefits of that housing. And locally here in South Bend, we also have an ordinance that says you can't discriminate in housing based on race, religion, color, sex, it's all up there, but ours adds sexual orientation or gender identity. The purpose of this ordinance is to promote the equal opportunity for people to have safe, affordable housing in our community. there are some unfortunate statutes. Well, a very unfortunate landlord-tenant statute was passed by the Indiana legislature, vetoed by the governor, and then the veto overridden by our lovely legislature, that might endanger parts of this ordinance, though there, as we're going to talk through this today, I think it can survive for other reasons, and that's the fact that the ordinance adds sexual orientation or gender identity, which is not in the state statute, and the ordinance, the unfortunate law would prevent local entities from passing ordinances that they say interfere with the landlord-tenant relationships. However, that portion of the act is being amended, allegedly. It's still, there's a conflict between the House and Senate versions, but there's a sense that would change. But I think that this could survive for other reasons that when we get into the discussions of what discrimination based on sex means, you'll see. But I know that there's been concern in the local community about whether this ordinance can survive, and I think it can for those reasons. And here it is. What is discrimination based on sex? And the Supreme Court in 2020 said that discrimination based on sex, and this was in an employment situation, not in a housing situation, but the statutes read the same. They said that discrimination based on sex also covers discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. So if you are discriminating on someone because they're gay or lesbian or transgendered, the Supreme Court says that necessarily and intentionally means that you're discriminating based on sex. So for that reason, I think that even if the explicit language were to come out of the ordinance, you still have the same protection because it's still discrimination based on sex. In January of this year, President Biden signed an executive order preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. And so this was to make explicit this administration's commitment to combating discrimination. That order covers pretty much every statute that deals with discrimination, but it does specifically cover the Fair Housing Act. So education, immigration, naturalization, civil rights, the Fair Housing Act. So the executive order covers all of the things that we're going to be talking about today, but also other things that are kind of related to it. And so the scope of the order that the president signed, the order requires all agencies and administrative agencies and officials that deal in these issues to review all of their regulations, orders, guidance documents, policies, programs, what they're doing, and to make sure that all of those are in sync with the law when it comes to sex discrimination. And then if they look at those and they say, hey, maybe we haven't been looking at this right, they're ordered to revise them, make whatever changes that they need to make. And by April 30th, which is coming around the corner here, they have to develop a plan to carry out the scope of the order and to make sure that their agencies are dealing with discrimination based on sex. So let's look at the Fair Housing Act and how it specifically deals with discrimination based on sex. So HUD has put out a series of examples and things about what discrimination based on sex can mean. And this is to really stress the fact that, when you think of discrimination based on sex, it's that you're giving different terms and conditions to somebody because they are a man or because they are a woman. And, typically it is because they are a woman. But what we also know is that it can apply in ways that maybe you hadn't thought about. And so this is a particular example that HUD gives as something that would be considered discrimination. And this was a situation where there was a transgendered woman. So someone who had been a man was now a woman, and was asked by the apartment complex to not appear in the lobby or in the common areas in women's clothes. This would apply to if so. The idea is that it is discriminatory if you are telling someone that they have to adhere to certain gender norms that you believe in, right? So if you're telling someone, a man, that he can't dress in women's clothes, or you're telling someone who's gay or lesbian that they can't, appear in the lobby with their partner, because they're somehow not fitting the ideals that you had of what a man or a woman is supposed to do, that is considered discrimination based on sex. The other part of this that comes up most often when you're dealing with the Fair Housing Act is the notion of sexual harassment in the Fair Housing Act. And unfortunately, we've seen a real rise in this. And part of this may be COVID, but I think a lot of it is the fact that there is such a shortage of of safe, affordable housing that people are afraid. They know that they're not going to be able to find other housing, and they're vulnerable. And the bad actors know people are vulnerable, know that it's hard to find housing, and so they pressure people to do things they don't want to do, right? And so if you can be liable for, actually I just looked and that's a typo. I thought I fixed all my typos this morning. So it's supposed to be quid pro quo and hostile environment harassment, not ad, but whatever. So there's really two kinds of sexual harassment under the Fair Housing Act. So quid pro quo would mean, well, I'm going to describe those in a second, so we'll just do that right now. So hostile environment, that is unwelcome conduct that's severe or pervasive, and that it interferes with the availability or the sale or the enjoyment of a property, right? Or the terms and conditions. It doesn't require that the person actually had to move, right? So what this can be is you've created a hostile environment. I think a common situation that comes up in these is that you have a maintenance worker at an apartment complex. Here, let me give you examples, right? Who is making inappropriate comments, asking for sexual favors, coming into your apartment late at night. I had one situation where the person was letting themselves in and just sort of standing over the bed watching the person. But this conduct is interfering with your enjoyment of your property and your ability to live in and be comfortable and safe. And even though it says sufficiently severe or pervasive, it can actually be one incident if it's bad enough, right? But it does sort of depend on what kind of conduct it is, how severe it is, how often it is. One-time flippant remark is probably not going to be a hostile environment, but a sexual assault clearly would be. And then also, who are the parties involved in the activity? Where is it happening? And how much is it affecting your use of the property? Again, one of the things that we see is, and it seems to be the common kind of case that comes up is, maintenance workers saying, I'm not going to fix your sink unless you have sex with me, or I'm not going to fix your sink unless you go out with me, that kind of thing. You don't have to have been physically harmed or even, quite frankly, psychologically harmed, though most people are psychologically harmed by this. And how the courts look at this is what would bother a reasonable person, right? So I think most reasonable people would be upset if the maintenance person told them they had to have sex with them in order to get their sink fixed, right? And as I mentioned earlier, even one act can be enough if it's bad enough. You know, if the what's being done is severe enough. Usually it's a pattern of different activity, but one can be enough. So in order to show that there's a hostile environment, and this comes from a federal case that's mentioned here, obviously the person being discriminated against has to be a member of the protected class, and they have to be subject to the unwanted sexual advances, favors, or other sexual conduct, and it's based on the sex of the tenant, right? So, and then it has to be severe, pervasive. Now, I do think that we tend to think of this as only can affect women, but clearly it could affect a man as well if, again, the advances and things are happening to them because they're a man, right? So whether the person making advances to them is a woman, or whether maybe it's a gay man making approaches to another gay man, or even not a gay man, but it tends to be more often that women are involved. Quid pro quo is more direct. In other words, if you want to rent this house, if you want to buy this house, if you want to get your sink fixed, you must have sex with me. You must do this certain thing with me. You must go out with me. And it's a violation whether you agree or not to do it. In other words, you could say, no, I refuse to do that. It's still a violation because your conditions of your housing were affected by this advance, basically. The other thing that I think people need to realize is that it doesn't have to actually be the landlord who is doing the harassing or the landlord's employees. And this is a Seventh Circuit case, and we are sitting in the Seventh Circuit, so this would apply to Indiana. And this was a case of an older woman who was living in an assisted living, well, like a senior living facility. And she was a gay woman, and she was being harassed by another tenant. And the court said that is also a violation because the landlord knew about it, knew that this woman was being harassed because she was gay, and didn't do anything to stop the harassment. In fact, what they did do was, according to the court, retaliate against her. So instead of dealing with the tenant that was doing the harassing, they restricted the woman who was being harassed. In other words, they told her, well, you're having all these problems with this tenant, so you can't go into the common areas, and you can't sit here at dinner because, it's bothering them. And so they basically began to build a case against her to evict her, essentially blaming her for the conduct of these other people against her. And so for it to be a retaliation claim happens when, the person is, as they say, engaged in protected activity, right? So I'm living in my apartment complex, or I'm trying to buy my house, or I'm doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. And you are infringing on that. You're not giving me the same benefits as other people in my apartment complex because I complained about the harassment, or I complained about, something that was happening to me. And what's really important here, because often when this happens, the landlords or the managers will say, well, it wasn't that we didn't like her. It wasn't that we had, any malice against her. You don't have to have had malice against her. You don't have to have not liked her. There just has to be a connection between the person complaining about the activity and you doing something that essentially punishes the person who complained, as opposed to the person who's causing the problem, the person who's doing the harassing. What's disturbing, if not interesting, There was a study done in 2013 on senior housing. So these are, folks, older folks. It was published in 2014, but it was done in 2013. And what they found is that discrimination has become a real barrier for older LGBT individuals who are looking for housing. In almost half the so they did testing of trying to find housing for older people, and they found that in almost half the times the person was discriminated against. The older person was discriminated against if they were believed to be gay or lesbian or transgender. And so this has become a real serious issue. And this is one of the reasons for the president's executive order, because this kind of discrimination is not allowed under the law. And it's becoming a real barrier to older Americans finding housing. Because there's a tendency when you reach a certain age to move from a single family residence into maybe an apartment or a townhouse or a condo with less maintenance and all those things, and that this discrimination is adversely affecting that population, and they're having more trouble being able to relocate into those kinds of housing. HUD has what they call the equal access rule, and that requires equal access to all of their programs without regard to a person's actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. I'm not that young that I don't remember the first time I tried to get a mortgage, and they ask, is your husband coming in too? You can't require me to bring my husband in if I have my own income. Now, I might want to bring my husband in, but you can't require that. And so any kind of HUD program that you're involved in, there has to be equal access, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, or gay or lesbian or straight. In February of 2020, actually, I'm going to check that. That might even be 2021, but anyway. So there was a period of time when really the government was kind of ignoring these claims and not really doing a very good job enforcing discrimination based on sex claims. And so according to this memorandum that was signed, they're going to now be accepting and investigating every complaint of sex discrimination, including if it's related to gender identity or sexual orientation. So they're going to be taking a much more serious and proactive stance on these kinds of claims. Now I'm going to move over to some domestic violence issues that I think are important and are in many ways related to the discrimination based on sex. Indiana has a statute that gives additional protection to tenants who have been victims of domestic or family violence, stalking, or other kind of sex offenses. And what this allows them to do is to leave a lease early, right? So if you are in fear, you're someone's stalking you, there's been domestic violence or whatever, you are allowed to terminate your lease early. You have to do this in writing to the landlord. You have to give them a copy of the relevant protection or no contact order. The statute also requires that you have a safety plan by an accredited domestic violence or sexual assault program. So in our local community, it'd be something like the Family Justice Center. And what that plan has to say is, look, this person is in danger. They really do need to relocate. This perpetrator is, not going away, not it continues to bother them. And so once you've gotten that notice, the landlord is required to let you terminate the lease. And obviously you would owe rent up to the time that you left, but you wouldn't be required to pay to the end of your lease term under those conditions. Unfortunately, a lot of people, well, that's probably an exaggeration. I think that sometimes people don't either know that they have this right, and so they just break the lease and end up having to pay, or they don't follow the written notice steps in the right way. But if you follow this in the right way, you've got the right to do that. And then related to this, landlords are not allowed to refuse to rent to you or refuse to renew your lease or refuse to let you rent because you were a victim in the past, because you have a protective order, or because maybe you terminated your previous lease early under that statute. And so that would be considered a violation of the statute if they said, no, I'm not going to rent to you because you rented from, my friend Harry and you left after 2 months because of this guy, and I don't want that to happen to me. You can't, that's considered retaliation under the statute. Now, there are two different sets of rules. If the perpetrator, so the person that is stalking you or sexually assaulted you or had been maybe a boyfriend or something who had beaten you up, if they are not a tenant with you, the landlord is required to change your locks if you are in fear. So maybe you gave this guy a key to your place, and now he beat you up, and now you're afraid, right? You have to give him written notice, and then the landlord has 48 hours in which he has to change your locks to protect you. And you have to give him a copy of your protective order or your no contact order. Now, again, it's an interesting thing that I see out there. People tend to understand this if the victim's a woman. If the victim is a man, we have a lot more trouble with this because there is this perception out there that men shouldn't be the victims of violence, which is not true, or domestic violence. And so in that sense, I have seen that you can see a little more discrimination based on if the victim tends to be a man. And I've had several situations where sometimes it was a wife that was the abuser, and sometimes it was a gay couple, and so it was a man-on-man abusing, but a lot more trouble getting the police and the authorities to pay attention when the victim is a man. Now, if the perpetrator is a tenant, in other words, you and your spouse are living there, or you and your partner are living together, the landlord in that case has to change the locks within 24 hours of receiving the court order. And the landlord can't be sued by the other person for locking them out. The person who is locked out based on the protective order is still liable for the lease, liable for the rent if they were on the lease. So if the two of you are on the lease and you get a court order that says he's got to go, the landlord can still collect rent from him even though he's the one that kicked out. And obviously until the lease is done. All right. I'm giving maybe more time than we need for talks. This is the other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is a really maybe interesting and kind of scary thing. So most Americans keep the vast majority of their wealth in their house, right? This is how people save for retirement. This is where our equity is now. I will tell you that I think this is probably a problem with how things are how people save money here in America. And I think we saw that when we had the housing crisis because so many people lost so much of their wealth. But it still is the dominant form of savings in America is housing wealth. But what we know about this is that this benefits men much more than women. And although we're talking about sex and not race, white men much more than people of color. And the reason for this is interesting. There's been several recent studies that have shown that men get more of a benefit out of owning and selling property. Single men get, as this one study showed, about a 1.5% higher returns when they sell houses. And when you account for mortgages, it's like a 7.9%. But this housing wealth gap, the difference between how women and men get to save money in their houses, explains 30% of the gender gap of retirement wealth. So we know that men have a lot more money at the end of retirement than women do. And most of it, or not most of this, a third of this can be explained by this housing wealth gap. Part of this has been attributed to the sort of gender bias in negotiations when you're buying and selling. And now I'm putting on my hat as a teacher of negotiations. There have been many studies in this that show there is a real gender bias in negotiations. So if a man is negotiating with a woman who's buying his house, a lot of the research will show that he will require higher minimum bids if he knows the buyer is female. In other words, he's going to require the woman to pay more. And what we also know is that women will offer more if they know the seller is male, right? So there's this tendency of them, both men and women expect women to be more willing to share the surplus. And what that means is that both men and women expect a woman to have to pay a man more or to get less in selling price if they're bargaining against the man. And both men and women get turned off if the woman who is negotiating is aggressive, right? And they're more willing to walk away. I'm not going to deal with you if you're not going to come down to my price. So there is a bias against women in negotiation that has been recognized across the board. So what tends to happen, well, I'll get to that in a second. What tends to happen is that women pay more when they're buying a house and sell for less when they're selling a house. And this, in the end, results in women not getting as much equity and not getting as much benefit from housing as men do. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's just a very interesting fact to be aware of. The other place that we're seeing a real disparity based on gender is in eviction. There have been a couple of recent studies. This one was done in Baltimore, but there have been others, and we'll talk about in a minute, that show that more women are evicted than men. So in Baltimore, it was 46% more female-headed households faced eviction than male. And of course, Black women, almost 4 times more than white women. A lot of this has to do with the wealth gap, right? Where women just aren't making as much money as men, don't make as much money per dollar as men. They're poorer, and therefore they get evicted more often. And some of it is overt discrimination, where certain things that women do make landlords more upset than if a man would do it, and therefore they get evicted. This study was done by several people. Many of you might recognize Matthew Desmond's name. He is the one who wrote the very famous book called Evicted, and he's been doing a lot of research on evicted. He looked at 39 states and found that Black female renters had eviction rates that are 6.4%, which is twice that of white females, and that overall women get evicted about 2% higher rate than men. This is a serious problem right now because of eviction being such a real problem in our community, in our nation, but in our community. We have extremely high eviction rates, and because of that, we have an awful lot of women who are being evicted. So, questions, comments? What can I do for you?
So, Judy, I have a question. I know you're familiar with the Violence Against Women's Act, and that primarily has to do with federal housing or federal recipient housing. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And there have been issues recently of authorization and reauthorization as to whether things that will happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned, Indiana does have statutes here that I don't think people are aware of, mm-hmm. and I don't think that they take advantage of. And there are some problems in understanding, I think, both for landlords and tenants, and frankly, the police department, on how those operate. Mm-hmm. but I think it's important for people to be aware of them, because the one thing we want to make sure is that people are safe. And so people
Right.
shouldn't stay in housing if they're not safe. And right now, a lot of, I mean, this is something that we see across the board, is that people are staying in unsafe housing because either they don't have an alternative, or they don't know that they might have a right to, like, for instance, remove the perpetrator.
So I found it interesting that you stated that a person can actually go to, say, for example, like the family violence or the family, is it the Family Justice Center?
Yes.
Do and work on a like a written plan
Right.
to provide to the landlord. What specifically in that plan, and is it a plan that the that both the person who's being stalked, harassed, or is the victim of domestic violence, is it something that is worked up together in conjunction with the agency, and is there any enforcement behind that? Should there
There's
be?
there's not so much enforcement behind it, except that you could show to the landlord and to prove that the person is not going to be safe staying in this house. So it's a way to talk about how to be safe. So I used to write these years ago when I did a lot of this work in Michigan. So
Mhm.
kinds of things that would be in this are, where you're going to go if he shows up, who are you going to call,
Mhm.
have you informed your job not to let this person in,
Mhm.
um, have you informed, basically taken information off your Facebook page about where you're living. So it's
Mhm.
it's all those kinds of things about how to think strategically about how to stay safe and away from the perpetrator, and how the statute plays into it. And this is, again, in my opinion, a problem with the statute,
Mhm.
uh, in that a lot of people don't do these written safety plans, and the statute requires, if you're going to break your lease, you have to show this to your landlord.
Mhm.
But the importance of it, though, is that if in doing this plan, you and the um, counselor or whatever has decided that, sometimes it's safe to stay in the housing and just remove the person. But
Mhm.
sometimes you've got such a person that isn't that is has disregarded it, or has tried to break in, or continues to follow you, that you just really need to be removed from that housing, and that gives that sort of proof of that.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for that. Thank you. So, and I have a quick question about the evictions. I know we've been talking about them for a while, and I know the moratorium continues to be extended. But and I know this is a little bit different than the topic that we're covering today. But do I can imagine what the rates will be like once the moratorium lifts. Are there any other provisions that you see that might be put into place, or anything at all to?
No. And so, first of all, the moratorium is very narrow.
Hmm.
The moratorium only covers you if you are unable to pay your rent because of some financial hardship. It was originally very much tied to COVID. It's not necessarily now.
Hmm.
So good news is there's a lot of money out there right now to help people who
Right.
might be in that situation. But bad news is that you can be evicted because you're on month-to-month tenant, and the month is up, or the house is being sold. We're seeing an awful lot of these. One of the things that's happening in rental housing, and I think this is a disaster for us locally as well as nationally, is a lot of housing is being bought up by investors, a
Hmm.
lot of institutional investors.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's causing rents to rise,
Hmm.
causing a real major shortage in housing. So a lot of these properties are being bought up by investors, and then they're asking the current tenants to get out. Now, in some sense, you know, I understand they want to fix the house up and they want to make it better so they can rent it for more money.
Hmm.
Um, but the problem is we have such a shortage of affordable housing in our community. I mean,
Hmm.
again, it's not just us, but
Right.
we have such a shortage of affordable housing. Um, I just don't know where all these people are going to go.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and it is a national problem. And there's this I would say, myth out there that evictions have stopped. There are still an awful lot of evictions going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a crisis. It's a crisis across the whole country, and it has been made worse because of the economic situation. But the other thing is, and this then goes to what we were talking about today, we also find people who are staying in very unsafe situations or situations where they're being harassed
Mm-hmm.
because they don't feel like they have any other alternatives. And I have to be honest with you, I can't tell you that they do have other alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the alternatives are very, very lean.
Hey, Judy, Ed Henry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, sir.
Going back to the early termination uh, of a lease, and we talked about written safety plan.
Yes.
Are there other options if I choose not to go that route to terminate my lease?
Not under that statute. Now,
Okay.
obviously, if the landlord agrees to it, that's always a possibility.
Oh, sure. Right.
But
Mhm.
I think people don't understand that if you terminate your lease early, most leases are written in such a way that you're going to owe all of the months.
Yes.
Now, landlords do have a duty to mitigate their damages. In other words, if they can re-rent that place, and they do, they can't charge double rent. In other words, you terminate your lease now, and in June I get a new renter. I can't charge the new renter and you for the rest of the year. So there is that duty to mitigate. But even though there's a housing shortage, people are less willing or to move around, and it it's a little harder, I think, right now to even to re-rent, even though there's a housing shortage, because people are a little more reluctant to be looking. They're staying in places longer, even if they don't like them because of COVID, and they don't want to be out there, looking at housing.
Right. And the other question I have, we've talked about it's a misdemeanor if you interfere with someone trying to buy, sell, rent, or how is that classification misdemeanor? Is that severe enough to cause one not to interfere, or do you think that should be upgraded?
Well, personally, I don't think it is, but but it is criminal as opposed to civil, right?
Okay.
So that can deter some people. And I always say this: there's kind of two levels of people out there, right? And this goes very much to the domestic violence setting, right? Some people get a protective order against them, and they say, "Oh, wait a minute, I better back off." Some people don't really care what the law says or what they're doing, right? And so for a lot of people, the fact that it could be a criminal offense, even just a misdemeanor, is going to be enough for them to say, yeah, this isn't worth it. You're always going to have those folks out there that don't care. And again, I think a lot of this comes down to people don't know they have rights.
Right.
And so, if someone is being harassed in a housing situation or facing this kind of hostile environment, they feel like, that they don't have many options, that there's nothing they can do. So they'll either suffer through it or just leave. And I would, strongly recommend folks, even if they're going to just leave, to at least report it to the Human Rights Commission, because it's likely to happen to the next person.
Right. Good point. Good point.
And I am appalled. I am amazed and appalled at the rise of when you see the rise in actual complaints filed in court on something, that there's actually much more of it out there. But the rise of this sort of sexual harassment, quid pro quo, I can't tell you how many clients I've had locally who have had landlords demanding sex to stay, or coming into their bedrooms at night demanding sex, or sending work. I mean, to me, that is just disgusting and appalling. But again, if it doesn't get reported, then somebody else is going to rent from this person.
Right.
But I know I think people are afraid.
Right.
I interrupted you.
No, you're good. No, and I think you're absolutely right that people are afraid and or fear further retaliation or the eviction on the record, because then of course that really causes an issue going forward to be able to rent anywhere else. You have that eviction on the record. How do you prove that it's retaliation, or that it was retaliatory because you objected to the sexual advances? And I know you mentioned, you mentioned in one of your slides that even if the person that is being sexually harassed feels they have no other choice but to interact with the individual, unfortunately, who is harassing them. At this point, and again, I realize that it's difficult in that moment not to agree to the actions, because again, you're trying to safeguard your house, you're trying to safeguard the place where you live, your roof, your children, etc. But I guess what I want to say is that we should be saying that we should remove the fear factor that even if you did agree to the actions because you felt forced to do that does not mean that you can't report it. You should be reporting it.
And legally, it doesn't. Legally, you can still report it. And whether you agree to it or you don't, right? Because some folks will make the defense that, well, yeah, I asked her to, but she never did, so it wasn't harassment, right? Yeah. So on both ends, you should definitely report it. But I think that you're right. I think people who actually give in are less likely to report because they feel guilty. They feel, well, I let it happen, which is just not true. And I think it's so important for those folks to make a report. And frankly, and again, I'm just basing this on sort of the case law, which doesn't necessarily mean different things. But, oftentimes it's like a maintenance worker or a manager. And sometimes like your actual landlord or your owner would really like to know that person's doing that, because they would really like to fire them if they knew that, right?
Absolutely.
This is going to happen to somebody else. The issue of retaliation is problematic in our state, especially because of this very, 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 very bad statute that was enacted in, again, it's the one the governor overruled and vetoed, and they've overruled, which makes retaliation claims harder under state law.
Yeah.
You still have the federal law. Right. And there are efforts to mitigate that statute, and I'm hoping that happens. But that's one of the concerns that I have with that statute, because so many of the people I deal with are on month-to-month leases. And so it's much harder to make a retaliation claim when, the landlord says, well, the lease is up, so you have to go. And this statute makes that even harder.
So what motivates a landlord to offer up a lease that's on a month-to-month? I mean, that just seems to be.
Yeah, and the motivation is that I can evict you for any reason at any time.
Yeah.
That's the motivation. And there have been efforts to require leases, some states to require leases. We have too many landlords in the legislature, apparently. And I will go out on a limb by saying that there has been an absolute assault on tenants in our legislature.
I agree.
And so that's really upsetting. But I recommend to people, if at all possible, to get a written lease. At least you have some protection.
Right. Judy, Ed, again, you had mentioned, we had talked about a lot of tenants just don't know their rights.
Right. And
one of my questions is, are housing agency required to review this with, tenants, like the housing authority, for example? Are they required to go through these things that we've talked about with the, with the person before
So not only are they not required, that was one of the main things that the legislature was going after. They to make it illegal for local entities to require. So what had happened in Indianapolis, which prompted this statute, was that the Indianapolis had passed an ordinance that required landlords to inform tenants of some of their basic rights.
Mhm.
And so this statute makes it illegal to do that, which is to me the most obscene, horrible thing, to make it illegal for your government to tell you what your legal rights are. Right? So I will say that there are many efforts across our community to try to educate tenants. The New South Bend Tenants Association has been working on that. Me in conjunction with them, I did a very, very short video, not fabulous. They have on their website just giving some basic information to tenants. The plan was, and then COVID hit, but we're going to try to do it, as soon as we can, is to go out into some, apartment complexes, community centers, churches, to give information about some of these rights to tenants.
Yeah.
So, if anybody wants that to happen in their area, just give me a call, because we would love to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is that video available to other agencies as well, or?
Yeah, I'd probably make it better, but it's on their website. But yeah. As I told you,
for that.
After I made it, I was like, oh man, it's it's hard talking to the space. Like it's just, yeah. I told them I'd like some students to make it a little more fun and entertaining, but not very fun and entertaining.
And then I also wanted to just share that, and you mentioned this earlier on about the Fair Housing Act, and I think sometimes that there have been times that we have received calls about, what that means and what it is and what their rights are. And oftentimes we hear, oh, well, we thought it was just for public housing, or just for recipients of Section 8, or just for, just for. And so I think we get caught up in the just fors, but actually it's also for private housing as well. I mean, there are a few exemptions, but for the most part, the Fair Housing Act is the Fair Housing Act. And have you run across that in any of your presentations, or your audiences?
Yeah, actually, I have, and people have mentioned that. Well, I'm I don't have Section 8, but this is happening, and it's actually I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen in public housing, and God, I wouldn't say that,
right.
But I think it's actually probably a bigger problem for people outside of those arenas, right? And I mean, it's still happening, and sometimes it's not intentional, but sometimes it really is. And I think it's hard. The problem is it's hard to know, right? You're trying to find housing, and you get turned down. You don't know necessarily why you got turned down. And I do think that people should ask, right? So first of all, if you got turned down based on some kind of credit report or whatever, you're entitled by law to get a copy of that. It might be wrong, right? They may be showing you have an eviction when you don't. They may have you mixed up with somebody else. You could fix it. But, if people can't give you a reason, that's something to be suspicious of. What we find, and this is why testers are so important, but what we find is that, or what the research shows is that when there's discrimination, it's not so much that you apply and they turn you down, it's that they never call you back, right? Oh, I don't want to rent to a woman, or I don't want to rent to someone who's Black. So you inquiring about the apartment, and we're just not going to call you back, and then I can be. But that could possibly be discrimination. And, it's worth looking into it, because then, and we need to do a better job, I think, of sending testers out there. COVID has just sort of slowed the world down, but, because it's interesting to note that some people only seem to rent to certain kinds of people. Let's put it that way.
No, it's very true. And I know that last week I was on a panel discussing the redlining issue, and I kind of shared as well that, you know, before you go into purchasing a home or any of that, learn the process. HUD has a guide. It's the Fair Housing Lending Guidebook. It's very comprehensive. It actually will walk you through what you need to know, what you can ask for, what your rights are. And I think that sometimes, you know, we don't, at times we don't know when we walk into a bank what we're supposed to be asking for, what we should be looking for. If we happen to be turned down for a loan, there is information and data out there, the HMDA, the HAMDA, HMDA Act information. You can contact the Consumer Bureau as well. You know, you can report credit issues and or credit discrimination to the Equal Credit Protection Act. So
yeah, I didn't really talk about that too, but the Credit Protection Act, oh my gosh, now I just lost my thought. But anyway, you have to be offered and presented credit in a non-discriminatory way. And I think people don't understand that you know, the basis of all of these laws are that you're supposed to be able to shop around for credit.
right.
And we're talking about housing now, but this applies to cars and things as well.
Mm-hmm.
The banks are required to give you sort of in writing a printout of, here's what you're asking to borrow, here's how much the interest rate is, here's what's going to cost you, so that you could say, okay, well, this bank is offering me this, well, I'm going to go to this other bank, and hey, they're giving me a better rate.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to shop for the car or shop for the house, but not shop for the credit.
Right.
And we should be shopping for the credit as well, because that's where we see the discrimination. Where people are given less favorable credit, not based on their credit scores or their credit history, but based on their race or their sex.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I mean, that was something that we you know, definitely covered last week. And it was interesting to me that, you know, those resources are not as easily as easy to find. But I, you know, here at the commission, we have that information available so that if someone needs it, you know, we'll print up the guide for you or send it to you or mail it to you. You know, it's a lot of information, but it's worth reading.
And I would say that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau website has a lot of these tools on it that can help you walk through the process. And this is sort of a teaser for next week. One of the areas where we see a lot of discrimination, largely targeted to the Hispanic community, is in the area of land contracts. And I think part of that is because people don't know that there are loans available if you are an undocumented immigrant. They're called ICE loans. And so people get forced into bad situations because, and that is one area, and that is a community that I think we need to do a better job of reaching, that has really suffered under COVID. Well, not just COVID, I'll be blunt, the last administration. A lot of fear out there, and so people have been stayed in really bad situations in housing out of fear.
Yeah, I agree, and that is a teaser. And that, so just for that information, I will share with you that next week Judy will be back, and we'll be covering the topic of land contracts at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of April. We usually send out email blasts, and we have been sharing this information via social media. But if you would like specific information, if you would like a copy of the slides from today's training, feel free to contact the commission. We have commission information that Alyssa Allstott has been posting in the meeting chat. We also have an evaluation. If you would please like to participate, we would love your feedback. And at this time, Judy, I would like to thank you so very much for such an informative presentation as always. And we are excited to see you next week as well. So
glad to join you. And as I said before, if anybody has issues that they would like to talk to me about, I'm always out there.
Well, we
All right.
appreciate that. We appreciate
you.
that.
Thank you.
See you next week.
See you next week. So Ed, thank you for co-facilitating. I appreciate
Yes.
your participation. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you so very much for your time and attention. And we hope to see you next week. And lastly, I'd like to, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the staff from the Human Rights Commission, which is Deetra Pickens and Alyssa Alstad and Crystal McCain. Thank you so very much for your time. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Ken. Bye-bye.
Bye now.